Our goal is to add file IO persistence to our journal, but I feel like our app is getting too complicated, and this code that we're writing is actually doing several things. It's both interacting with the user and dealing with the UI, as well as kind of managing this journal data. And it would be much better if we could separate those. On one hand, we have this journal thing that takes care of itself, and we have our UI bits, and they can just interact with that journal. One really nice way to do that in Python is to create a separate module or a separate file. So let's just call this journal. Here we're initializing, we're creating this journal, and this is okay, it works. But remember, we'd like to initialize this from a file where we've saved an existing journal, load it up, create a new one if the file doesn't exist, all that kind of stuff. So this is going to get way more complex instead of this one line here. So let's move that over into our journal code, and we'll call it something like load. So over here, we're going to define a load method. And let's suppose it's going to take the name of the journal. And its counterpart, we're going to write later, is going to be save. And again, this is going to take a name. Now for the load, let's just temporarily write the code to basically do what we were doing before, just create an empty journal. And we're storing the journal data as a list, so let's do this. And just to remind ourselves, let's add a little to-do. Okay, so we'd like to populate this from the file if it exists. Similarly, we'd like to save something here. We're going to need a name. We're also going to need the journal data. We'll have to pass it in. So how do we access these methods, which we're going to fill out with more interesting bits in a moment? How do we access those over here? First of all, let's just try to write it. We could try to write load, and there's obviously no load here. We could write journal.load, and there's no journal either. So obviously, like before, when we were working with, say, the random class and various other pieces, we need to import it. So the way you do this is the same whether you're working with a built-in module, an external module you've got from PyPI, or just one of your own scripts that you're going to load up and consume. So here we're going to say import journal. You can see PyCharm is saying, yep, that seems like a good thing to do. And down here, we can say something like journal dot, and there's our load and our save. So we can write it like this. Now notice we said import journal. Clean that up for a moment. We said import journal, and down here we say journal.load. So this style is referred to as namespaces. There are other ways we could import this. I could have said something like this instead. I could have said from journal import, and I could just name off the things like load and save. And then down here, I could just call load without the journal, right? Now, it depends on the method you're working with. It depends on how frequently you're using it. But my preference is definitely to use this style because it's extremely explicit where it comes from. If I just call load, it's not entirely obvious where it comes from. Now, there's a way to write this code where it's even less obvious. Say, we just want to report everything from that journal module and just put a star like this, from journal import star. That would be as if we named every single thing that was in there. And that's even less good. It's less explicit. And you can run into the possibility of name clashes. Like imagine two different modules both have the method load. Which one are you going to get? Yeah, it gets complicated. So I would say avoid this one. Prefer this one. Sometimes this one is totally good too. So we're going to say import journal. We're going to come down here and say load. Now you can see that PyCharm is saying we want to give it a name. So let me just create a variable for our named journal. We'll call it journal name. And it can just be something like default, something along those lines. Okay, and down the end, let's make sure we do a save. So we'll say journal.save, and we'll give it the name and the data. So the save really does nothing. Remember, it was just pass. This load really was just returning a new instance of the list, but that should mean it really just works exactly like before. So let's add first item, second item, and list them out. Hey, it looks like it's working, and it exits. Okay, so we were able to use a separate file to store some of our logic in here. If you come down here, you can see there's something I'm not a real big fan of down here with this add entry is we're directly working with this data structure. And I'd much rather move this over into the journal pieces. However, not this part, because this has to do with the UI. So instead of writing this code, I could write journal.add entry and just pass the text here instead of this. could, of course, go over to the journal file, right at entry, just kind of as you see it here. But let me just show you a cool trick with PyCharm. So PyCharm knows that the journal.py file relates to this namespace here, and it knows that this does not exist. So if we hit Alt-Enter, it'll say, hey, would you like me to write this method for you over here? Yes, please. So we can actually just use this Alt-Enter trick to sort of avoid a lot of typing and get everything exactly like we were planning on there. So remember, this was like this, and I forgot to pass the journal data, so kind of unfortunate. Now, this probably would be much better modeled as a class, but hey, it is what it is. Okay, so I think we moved the logic that manages the journal over into this journal.py module. Now, we haven't written the real complex code yet, but we're about to. Before we do, let's just review this whole import story. This is one of our core concepts